February 5th, 2003. The entire world is watching one room. The United Nations Security Council, New York City. The most powerful leaders on the planet are sitting in silence, waiting. Camera flashes, whispered translations, the weight of something enormous, hanging in the air. And then he walks in. Colin Powell, 4-star general, former national security advisor, the most trusted soldier in America, a man who had spent his entire life building a reputation for integrity, discipline, and truth. He sits down, opens a folder, looks up at the room, and begins to speak. He talks for 76 minutes. He shows satellite images of what he calls secret weapons facilities. He plays audio recordings of Iraqi commanders, allegedly discussing chemical weapons. He holds up a small vial of white powder and tells the world that Saddam Hussein has enough biological weapons to kill thousands. The room is silent. The world is watching, and it works. Within weeks, the coalition is assembled. Within months, the bombs are falling on Baghdad. Within a year, over 100,000 Iraqi civilians are dead. The country is in flames, and the Middle East will never be the same again. There is just one problem. Every single thing in that folder was fabricated. The satellite images were misrepresented. The audio recordings were taken out of context. The biological weapons never existed. The white powder Powell held up in front of the entire world was a prop in a performance that had been rehearsed, edited, and signed off by the highest levels of the United States government. Colin Powell knew it felt thin. He reportedly called the intelligence bullshit in private the night before the speech. He pushed back. He questioned it. He spent 4 days at CIA headquarters trying to verify what he was being asked to present to the world. But he stood up anyway, and the world believed him because they trusted him. That trust cost over 1 million lives. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is not speculation. These are documented facts, confirmed by Senate investigations, declassified CIA reports, and Colin Powell himself, before he died in 2021, calling that speech a permanent blot on his record. The most dangerous lie in history is never the one told by a monster. It is the one told by a good man who chose the institution over the truth. Stay uncomfortable. Here is a question that nobody in mainstream media wants to answer. If the intelligence was wrong, who got it wrong? Because there is a big difference between a mistake and a construction. A mistake is when you look at the evidence and draw the wrong conclusion. A construction is when you decide the conclusion first and then build the evidence around it. What happened after September 11th, 2001 was not a mistake. Within 24 hours of the Twin Towers falling, before the dust had even settled, before a single investigation had begun, senior members of the Bush administration were already asking one question: how do we connect this to Iraq? Not Afghanistan, not Al-Qaeda, not Osama bin Laden. Iraq, a country that had nothing to do with 9/11. A fact that the FBI, the CIA, and every serious intelligence analyst on the ground confirmed repeatedly. Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda were not allies. They were ideological enemies. Everyone in that building knew it. But the decision had already been made. So they built a machine to manufacture the truth they needed. It was called the Office of Special Plans. set up quietly inside the Pentagon by Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld and Vice President Dick Cheney. This was a secret intelligence unit with one specific purpose: to go through every piece of raw intelligence coming out of the Middle East, find anything that could be stretched, twisted, or reframed to point toward Iraq, and feed it directly to the White House, bypassing the CIA entirely. Let that sink in. They didn't just ignore the intelligence agencies that were telling them the truth. They built a separate intelligence operation, specifically designed to produce a different truth. The analysts inside the CIA were filing report after report saying the evidence was weak, unreliable, and, in some cases, coming from sources that had already been flagged as untrustworthy. One key source, codenamed Curveball, was a single Iraqi defector living in Germany. German intelligence had already warned the Americans that he was unstable, unreliable, and possibly fabricating everything. That warning was buried. Curveball's stories about mobile biological weapons labs became a centerpiece of Powell's UN presentation. And it gets darker. The weapons inspectors were already on the ground in Iraq. Hans Blix and his team from the United Nations had been given full access, visiting site after site, and finding nothing. No chemical weapons, no biological labs, no nuclear program. Blix stood in front of the Security Council and said it clearly. "We have found no evidence of weapons of mass destruction." The Bush administration's response? They told the inspectors to leave Iraq, because the war was already scheduled to begin. And the inspectors were getting in the way of the story. This is the part that should make you stop breathing for a second. The people tasked with finding the truth found nothing. So the people who wanted the war removed them, and then told the world the inspectors hadn't finished their work yet. There was no accident here, no intelligence failure, no honest mistake made under pressure. There was a room full of powerful men who wanted a war, for reasons that had nothing to do with weapons, and everything to do with something else entirely. And that something else is exactly where we are going next. Stay uncomfortable. Here is the most uncomfortable truth of this entire story. They weren't all fooled. Some people got it exactly right. They saw through the presentation. They questioned the evidence. They stood up, spoke out, and told the world clearly, this is not what they are telling you, it is. And the machine destroyed them for it. Let's start with the man who was physically inside Iraq. Hans Blix, Chief UN Weapons Inspector. A quiet, methodical, deeply experienced diplomat who had spent decades in arms control. He wasn't anti-American, he wasn't political. He was just doing his job. And his job was telling the truth about what he found. He found nothing. Site after site, facility after facility. His team searched everywhere the intelligence pointed and came back empty-handed every single time. He stood in front of the Security Council and said it carefully, professionally, and clearly. The evidence does not support the claims being made. The Bush administration's response was not to reconsider. It was to discredit him. Senior officials briefed journalists off the record that Blix was naive, incompetent, and being manipulated by Saddam. They painted a picture of a well-meaning old man who simply didn't understand what he was dealing with. The inspectors were pulled out. The bombs started falling. Blix watched it happen from New York. He said later, "I felt we were inconvenient. Then there was Joe Wilson, a former U.S. ambassador sent by the CIA itself to investigate one of the key claims in Bush's case for war. The claim that Saddam Hussein had tried to buy yellowcake uranium from Niger to build a nuclear weapon. Wilson went to Niger, spoke to officials, reviewed the documents. He came back and told the CIA, "The story is false. The documents are forged. This did not happen." The White House used the Niger claim in Bush's State of the Union address anyway. Wilson had had enough. He wrote an article in the New York Times saying publicly the administration had manipulated intelligence to justify the war. The response was immediate. Within days, someone inside the White House leaked the identity of Wilson's wife, Valerie Plame, to the press. She was an undercover CIA operative. The leak destroyed her career, compromised her network of contacts, and sent a message to every intelligence analyst and diplomat watching. Speak up, and we will burn everything you have built. And then there were the journalists. Robert Fisk, one of the most experienced Middle East correspondents in the world. He was on the ground in Iraq before the invasion, filing reports that directly contradicted the official narrative. He wrote that the evidence for weapons of mass destruction was thin, that the Iraqi people were not the threat they were being portrayed as, and that this war was being built on a foundation that would not hold. He was dismissed as a conspiracy theorist, a Saddam sympathizer, an anti-American voice not worth listening to. The same newspapers and television networks that called him unreliable spent the next 2 years cheerleading a war built entirely on the lies he had already exposed. And here is the pattern that should disturb you deeply, because it is not unique to Iraq. Every time a government decides it wants a war, the machine that builds the case follows the same steps. First, create the threat. Second, amplify the fear. Third, discredit anyone who questions the evidence. Fourth, move fast enough that by the time the truth catches up, the bombs have already fallen and the maps have already changed. They did it in Iraq in 2003. They have done it before. And if you have been watching this channel long enough, you already know they are doing it again. The people who got it right were not smarter than everyone else. They were just willing to pay the price for the truth. Most people are not, and that silence is exactly what the machine counts on. Stay uncomfortable. No weapons of mass destruction were ever found. Not one shell, not one lab, not 1 gram of chemical agent. The entire case that Colin Powell presented to the world, the satellite images, the audio recordings, the diagrams, all of it led to nothing. The most expensive and intensive military search in modern history came back empty. So we have to ask the question that the mainstream media spent years avoiding. If it was never about weapons, what was it about? Let's follow the map first. Iraq sits on the 5th largest oil reserve on the planet. Before the invasion, Saddam Hussein was selling that oil exclusively in euros, not dollars. That might sound like a small financial detail. It is not. The entire global oil market runs on American dollars. Every country that wants to buy oil has to hold American dollars to do it. That system, called the petrodollar, is one of the foundations of American economic dominance. Saddam switching to euros was not just a financial decision. It was a direct challenge to American power. And he was not the first. Libya's Muammar Gaddafi had been pushing for an African gold-backed currency to replace the dollar in oil trades for years. You already know what happened to both of them. Now follow the money. Within months of the invasion, Iraq's oil was back on the dollar system, and the contracts to rebuild the country that had just been destroyed went to American corporations. Halliburton, the company previously run by Vice President Dick Cheney, received contracts worth over $39 billion. Not millions, billions. Awarded without competitive bidding, in a country that American bombs had just reduced to rubble. The same man who helped build the case for the war personally profited from the reconstruction of the country the war destroyed. But there is a deeper layer that most people never reach. 4 years before 9/11, before the towers fell, before anyone had heard the words weapons of mass destruction in relation to Iraq, a group of neoconservative thinkers published a document. It was called the Project for the New American Century. It was signed by Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, Paul Wolfowitz, and others who would go on to become the architects of the Iraq War. That document called for the removal of Saddam Hussein and the reshaping of the entire Middle East to secure American dominance in the region for the next century. It specifically mentioned that this process would be slow, unless there was a catastrophic and catalyzing event, like a new Pearl Harbor, that would accelerate public support for military action. That document was written in 1997. 9/11 happened in 2001. The Iraq War started in 2003. Connect those dots yourself. This was never a reaction to a threat. It was a plan waiting for a moment. And when that moment came, the machine was already built. The arguments were already prepared. And the only thing left to do was find someone credible enough to stand in front of the world and sell it. They chose Colin Powell, and the world bought it. Stay uncomfortable. Let's talk about accountability, because this story doesn't end with the last bomb dropped on Baghdad. It doesn't end with the discovery that there were no weapons. It doesn't end with the country burning, or the region collapsing, or ISIS rising from the power vacuum that the invasion created. It ends with nothing. No trials, no prosecutions, no international criminal court, no perp walk, no moment where the architects of the biggest lie in modern history were made to stand in front of the world and answer for what they did. George W. Bush retired to his ranch in Texas and started painting portraits of soldiers. Dick Cheney wrote a memoir. Donald Rumsfeld gave interviews until the day he died, never once admitting he was wrong. Paul Wolfowitz, one of the key architects of the entire plan, was appointed president of the World Bank 2 years after the invasion he helped engineer. Over 1 million Iraqis died. That is not an estimate from a fringe report. That is the conclusion of peer-reviewed studies published in some of the most respected medical journals in the world. 1 million human beings, fathers, mothers, children, people who had nothing to do with 9/11, nothing to do with Al-Qaeda, nothing to do with any threat to the United States. They died for a lie that powerful men told in a room they will never be held responsible for. 4,500 American soldiers died. Hundreds of thousands came home with wounds that never healed. Physical and psychological. Fighting a war their own government knew was built on fabricated intelligence. And the media. The same newspapers and television networks that amplified every claim, that gave platform after platform to the men selling the war, that dismissed and ridiculed the people who got it right, never truly reckoned with what they did. A few quiet corrections buried on page 14. A handful of editors who admitted years later that they should have pushed harder. But no one lost their job. No network lost its license. No anchor sat in front of a camera and said, "We helped start a war that killed 1 million people. And we are sorry." They just moved on to the next story. And here is where it stops being history and starts being right now. Look at the language being used about Iran today. Listen carefully to the words. Existential threat, weapons of mass destruction, state sponsor of terror, destabilizing the region. The same vocabulary, the same rhythm, the same architecture of fear that was used to sell Iraq to the world in 2003. The playbook did not change because it worked. And it worked because we forgot. We forgot Iraq fast enough for them to use it again. We moved on fast enough for the machine to reset. We consumed the news cycle and scrolled to the next thing. And in that scrolling, we gave permission for history to repeat itself. The most powerful weapon a government has is not a missile. It is not a drone. It is not a nuclear warhead sitting in a silo somewhere. It is a population that doesn't remember. You remember now. So the question is not what they did. The question is what you do with the knowledge of what they did. Do you close this video and move on? Or do you become the person who refuses to be fooled twice? Share this video, not for the algorithm, not for the numbers, but because somewhere in your circle, there is someone who is hearing the same language about Iran that they heard about Iraq in 2003. And they don't see the pattern yet. Show them the pattern. Subscribe to Uncomfortable History. Because this channel exists for one reason only: to make sure the lies that cost 1 million lives are never comfortable enough to repeat. The truth is the only weapon they cannot manufacture. Stay uncomfortable.